Okay. Let's hope this is working, and let's hope this is working with sound. Looks like it's all set like it should. Okay. So, for those of you playing at home, we have just been casually sort of chatting and discussing some of the various laws of being a good consumer and being a righteous consumer, which is very fitting because we are now into Parashat Yitro, which is where we are beginning to get some of the more formal statements of law. Some of the more formal statements of what it means to be following the mitzvot. In fact, we're going to get 10 very famous statements in this parasha.
Yes.
Yes? Yes, Parashat Yitro, Parashat as the 10 Commandments, exactly. The Aseret HaDibrot, or the Decalogue, as it is often called, if you want to show off your Greek. So we're going to be taking a look not at the 10 Commandments to start. We're going to be looking at a different section, because trying to understand how the 10 Commandments, how law as a whole fits into Judaism, was actually going to take a little detour through a couple other scenarios before we finally come back, and hopefully, God willing, we got, what, an hour? We'll all come to a reconciled understanding of law that may be different than what we expect from our standard legal thinking within America, that also might make things better, more powerful, spiritual, etc. That's the goal. You're going to have to hold on for the ride. It's be bumpy in a few places, I'm sure, and I'm sure we'll get there. After all, we're going through Exodus. We should expect a bumpy ride. Okay, so we are in Yitro, which begins with chapter 18, and that's going to be on page 432. It's 18 of the book of Exodus. And we're going to start at the beginning, and then we're going to jump a little bit, and then we're going to get to our handout. So at the beginning, Parashat Yitro is called Yitro because Yitro in English means Jethro, right? Not just the guy from the Beverly Hillbillies. And Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. Excellent. And he shows up in the very first sentence, so that's why it gets called Yitro, for the name of the parasha. And we're going to see he's got some family business to take care of, and then he's got a little managerial advice for Moses. So who'd like to start us off doing the family bits?
I will.
Thanks.
I missed you guys. This is nice. Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out from Egypt. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent home, and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom, that is to say, I have been a stranger in a foreign land, and the other was named Eliezer, meaning, the God of my father was my help, and he delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' sons and wife to him in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God.
All right, so let's just make sure we got the whole narrative here, right? So Zipporah and the 2 boys were back in her father's house, while Moses was off doing his whole let my people go shtick in Egypt. Got that? They've now left, and now they are camped at the base of Mount Sinai, and it's time for a little family reunion. Make sense?
Did they all know about the miracles, with Moses and the people?
Well, Yitro certainly seems to know, because it says in those first few verses that he had heard all of the wonders and everything that had happened for Moses and the people of Israel. How much detail they knew or didn't know, we're not sure. But we do know that one of the purposes of the miracles in Egypt was to let the world know that God was on the stage and that God was protecting these people, the Israelites, and that God had plans. So he knew. How much? We're not sure. We're going to see that we're going to actually skip the section where he goes into some of the reflection on what God did. But he definitely knew enough to be impressed.
He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, completely ignored his wife and sons. He bowed low.
We can save Rashi for later.
And kissed him. Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent.
Okay, so Moses goes out, and he bows and kisses him. And then they each ask each other, how you doing? Sound good?
Maybe a small point, but the Torah never uses words lightly, but in 5 instances,
Mhm.
referring Yitro as father-in-law. Once would have been enough. Is there a deeper meaning?
Well, certainly the relationship is critical, that this isn't just some random guy, and it's also important to remember that historically the relationship between father-in-law and son was a very important bond to develop correctly. And I think what they're trying to say here is that it was. But how far that bond goes is a good question, because who's Moses? Right? I mean, where is he in the grand scheme of people right now?
God's right-hand man.
He's God's right-hand man. He's riding high. He's number one. Right? Now, Yitro is considered to be a Kohen of Midian, a priest of Midian. Who has status here? Who's on top? Is Moses below Jethro because he has to show respect to his father-in-law? Or is Yitro below Moses because he has to show respect to this man who's just been used as an instrument of God Almighty to lead a people out of Egypt in an unprecedented display of power and glory? Who's where?
Yes to both.
Yes to both. So who's bowing?
Moses.
Is that what it said?
Yes.
Is that what it
Moses
said?
is Eve.
Pronouns,
It says
people.
he.
Pronouns. Okay? So this actually becomes a controversial point among many of the commentators of who's bowing to whom. Because on the one hand, it would be very appropriate and very respectful for the average son-in-law to show that kind of deferential respect to his father-in-law. Right? And that's what all father-in-laws want.
But don't we know that Moses was, one of his attributes was being incredibly humble?
And indeed, Moses, as a humble person, of course, wouldn't abuse his position as being God's right-hand man, as Judy pointed out, to force his father-in-law to bow to him. It would be logical and natural for him on an emotional level to bow to his father-in-law to show that respect. On the other hand, there are also teachings that no matter how humble a person may be, if their status is contingent upon their Torah, contingent upon their relationship with God, they're not allowed to set that aside, even if they personally don't want it. Because to do so is not to make themselves look humble, but to make Torah or God look degraded. That's a very important tension that can often occur. You can't say, I don't need that. It's like the Rambam talks very much that if you are a Talmid Chacham, if you are a sage, if you are a leader in the community, you don't get to go around with schmutzy clothes and rips and tears. You have to fix them. You have to dress nicely. You have to, make sure you don't look like a slob. Because looking like a slob doesn't make it look like you don't care about your physical appearance. It makes it look like Torah is a slob. Because that's what people see when they see you. They see Torah. They're not bowing to you, they're bowing to your Torah. They don't get up when you walk in the room for you, they're getting up because of Torah. And you have to do your part to maintain the dignity of Torah. So on the other hand, we might expect that Yitro would bow to Moses, and that the Torah would expect that. And this ambiguity by pronoun is one of those great things the Torah does to us sometimes. What's that? Deliberately, absolutely. But the ambiguities are going to stretch a little bit further than this. We're going to come back to this topic and see how one source tried to resolve it. But I want to get one more controversy on the table before we start working through resolutions. So we're going to skip their little chit-chat where they talk about everything that happened. And we're going to pick up on the next page, 434, in verse 13. Please.
Next day, Moses sat as a magistrate among the people, while the people stood about Moses from morning until evening. But when Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing to the people? Why do you act alone while all the people stand about you from morning until evening?" Moses replied to his father-in-law, "It is because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes before me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make known the laws and teachings of God."
Okay, right? So the problem is, of course, father-in-law sees in son-in-law working himself to death. It's like, you know, he wakes up and he's at his job, and he doesn't stop until he collapses and falls asleep. And Yitro says, what are you doing to yourself? You can't do that. You're going to die. And Moses says, but I've got to. The people come to me with questions about God, about Torah, about law. I have to answer them. So what am I supposed to do? Just say, no, sorry, I need a break? Really? And the solution?
But Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing you are doing is not right. You will surely wear yourself out, and these people as well. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You represent the people before God. You bring the disputes before God, and enjoin upon them the laws and the teachings, and make known to them the way they are to go, and the practices they are to follow. You shall also seek out from among all the people capable men who fear God, trustworthy men who spurn ill-gotten gain. Set these over them as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Have them bring every major dispute to you, but let them decide every minor dispute themselves.
All right, we're going to pause there.
Very logical.
Very logical, right? Except for the one logical error of, can you find 1 out of 10 people?
Right.
Choose the cabinet. Go ahead.
1 out of every 10 person fits this qualification. Right? That's what they just said. Tall order. I think we might be hard-pressed to find 1 out of 10 that were perfect, or even this approximation of perfection. But that aside, the basic system of not an appeals court. Let's make sure this is clear, because it's often misunderstood. This isn't an appeals court. This is a hierarchy of learning and of skill. So you take your problem to your guy for the 10, and if he doesn't know the answer, he brings it to the higher level of learning. If that doesn't know the answer, you go up and up and up until you finally get to Moses, and if he doesn't know it, then he goes straight to the source, God. It's not that if you don't like the answer that the 1 in 10 gave you, that you go to the next level. That's an appeals process. That's not what we're talking about here. This is all about reaching a higher level of understanding and learning, that if the simple questions can be answered lower, you do that, but if they're harder, you go up. Make sense? Yes? Okay. Give me a timeline here. Okay, because there's a bit of a question mark, right? Because we have our wonderful 10 Commandments coming, right? That's my 10 Commandments. And by the way, no, there is no reason to think that they were rounded at top. That's just an artistic representation, and I really don't know where it came from. This system, where did it happen in the timeline of the 10 Commandments?
It must have happened afterwards.
What's that?
It must have happened after the law was given.
It must have happened after the law was given. So we have that's a judge. See the wig? Right. So we have the judges. This is our time happening after the giving of the 10 Commandments at Sinai. Is that the idea? Why would you say it has to have happened afterwards?
Because how can you adjudicate the law if you haven't been given the law yet?
If you don't have the law, if you haven't had the Sinai theophany, the experience of God at Sinai, what are you adjudicating? Agreements, rebuttals, questions, clarifications?
Well, before Egypt, with Abraham and Isaac, there had to be a sense of right and wrong, and there had to be adjudications.
I mean, they weren't just making it up.
Right. So that's all part of that continuum of.
And we already had Brit Milah. We had Gita Nashe, the sciatic tissue that had to be removed. We had all the laws of Korban Pesach, and we had other laws as well that have been mentioned prior to Sinai. Definitively mentioned prior to Sinai.
And Sabbath is mentioned definitively.
And the Sabbath has been mentioned as well.
And the rules thereof, and some of the rules thereof. How
Well,
long-
some of is the question, exactly. And as was also pointed out by Howie, you also had a big community. There would have been disputes, there would have been problems.
Right.
So maybe they didn't have the 10 Commandments yet, but there would have needed to have been some form of discussion and debate and reconciliation. You know, your goat ate my tent. Fix it. That kind of problem is going to come before someone in the community to get a resolution, or else you're going to have fist fights and knives in the dark really, really fast.
Could it have been some of each? Could the bureaucracy of this have happened after Sinai, but a looser judicial system have happened beforehand?
Well, let's take a specific story. We have Moses sitting in judgment day to night, and then Yitro telling him, delegate. Where did that story come in? Where does it come in the chapter order as far as the Torah is concerned?
We haven't seen the Ten Commandments yet.
Ten Commandments don't come till chapter 20.
But
Right.
that doesn't mean anything in Torah.
Okay, but we do have a principle of ein mukdam, ein muchar, that there's no before and after in the Torah, meaning you cannot always count on the chapter order to tell you the exact order of events, and that's explicit in some places. But here we would have a question of, well, why wouldn't we interpret it as happening before Sinai? The Torah put it here, it would make sense. Yitro just arrived, so it's a natural conversation. He shows up, he sees his son-in-law working too hard and not serving the people well because one man can't do enough for all of them. Why wouldn't he have said it even though they haven't had the experience at Sinai yet? Maybe.
Well, he had to change it from a mob into some sort of a cohesive system where everyone knew that they could hear, that they would be heard.
That there would be a system and that there would be answers and that they could actually participate.
Well, my atheist friends love to tell me that common sense would lead you to understand some of these disputes and what the right thing is to do, even if God never told you anything.
Exactly. Common sense always tells me that my goat didn't do anything wrong. And common sense tells my neighbor that my goat needs to be destroyed.
Or my dog never does anything wrong. It was
Exactly.
you who provoked him.
I would point out that to be fair to atheists, that they would, I'm sure, suggest that there would be a common sense discussion of the laws that preceded the resolution of specific cases, that they would pass communal legislation that everyone would agree to abide by, and then once it came time to adjudicate, you would already be stuck with that resolution. If you didn't know whether your goat was going to cause problems or not, free of that self-interest, you probably could come to something reasonable, is the expectation. And indeed, Rambam discusses part of that in some of his works, of the idea that certain aspects of Torah and justice in the sketch, the outline, could be understood by rational inspection. It's the details and the workings of the law that we need a little more help with. At least is the opinion is we're going to see that we're going to move towards. All right, so first of all, you see one resolution at the top of the page to our question of who bowed to who. And in this reading, it says, and he bowed to Moses. Right, now remember, in the actual verse that we read, there was no to Moses. It just said Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed low and kissed him. Pronoun he, pronoun him. This particular version substitutes the word Moses rather than him, so that it becomes very clear that it was Yitro bowing to Moses. And what's the source?
Samaritan emendation.
The Samaritan Bible, or the Samaritan Torah to be precise. So the Samaritans are there still are some living in the land of Israel. There used to be a lot more of them. A sect that split off from Judaism 2,500 years ago. And they have their own copy of the Torah, but there are numerous differences, changes, between their copy and ours. And many of their changes reflect attempts to make things clearer according to their understanding. So they were bothered by this ambiguity and by the implied possibility that it was Moses bowing to Yitro. And to make sure that we didn't think that, they penciled in that it was Yitro bowing to Moses. They changed the text. And there are hundreds of examples throughout the Torah that the Samaritans used where they did similar words here, couple phrases here, to try and make things work better, to try and make things smoother, to avoid any misunderstandings.
But strictly from their perspective.
Of course, of course. So they changed a number of things that were to their advantage when it came to focusing on their holy mountain rather than Jerusalem, and when it came to making what they felt what they were doing as a more valid religious expression, and that the rest of us were the ones who got it all wrong. The history of the Samaritans is very, very interesting. A Samaritan is not just somebody who stops to help. That's very different. That's taking the parable as a definition, but it's not actually what was there. The reason why they had a Samaritan stopping to help was because the Samaritan was the last person you would expect to come help. And yet this person did, even when the Kohen and the Pharisee didn't. And that was supposed to show the hypocrisy of the Kohanim and the Pharisees. This is all in the Christian Bible if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about. It was meant to mock the Kohanim, meant to mock the Pharisees, and say even a Samaritan, even one of these guys, would stop to help, whereas the so-called righteous people don't. So they weren't held in good esteem by the early Christians either. But that's a whole other historical discussion, one worth having, but not today.
Which came first, the Samaritan emendation or the Mechilta?
The Samaritan emendation is most likely older in terms of its written form. The Mechilta is part of the oral Midrash. It eventually was written sometime in the 1st or 2nd centuries of the Common Era, but the Samaritans had already broken away by then and already had their own version, their own text. So the Mechilta has no problem with Moses bowing, and that's the general interpretation that many Jewish texts take. But like you can see, the text itself is ambiguous. They just tried to fix that ambiguity. And fixing ambiguity by fixing the text.
Yeah.
Well, let's understand. We go, yeah, but isn't that what you're supposed to do? Right? If Congress passes a law that's ambiguous, I know, perish the thought. What would we hope they would do the next time they were in session?
Resign.
I guess I set up that straight line, didn't I? What would we hope they would do with regards to the law that they had made that was ambiguous?
Clarify.
Fix it, clarify it, right? Failing that, we might, in the meantime, rely on judicial opinions, but what we would really like to see would be for the law itself to be written clearly. And with a human legislature, why not? Right? Just fix it. If the law isn't clear, go in and add an extra phrase, change the pronoun, whatever is necessary, make it clear. And that should be our gut instinct whenever we see a law that is unclear. Or whatever we. Well, except for Torah. What do we do when Torah is ambiguous or Torah is unclear?
You don't touch the text and you write a commentary.
You don't touch the text and write a commentary, which is great, but now you've got your commentary, I've got my commentary.
And we're both humble enough to understand that we don't have all the answers.
And what do I do about your goat and my tent? Because your commentary says that the goat's fine, and my commentary says that you need to pay. When there's ambiguity, when the tire hits the road, as they say, ambiguity doesn't work so well in a system of justice and law.
It's just like this strange practice that some people have of shopping for a rabbi until they find one who gives them
the answer they like.
You don't do that. I don't think that that's a good thing to do.
All right, so we're going to talk about, because this whole issue of ambiguity and what to do and why we don't amend the text, why we don't do the Samaritan route of getting out the whiteout and just changing it, and why we do what we do and what it is we do, is a major issue for what it means to be a modern Jew. It's a major issue of what it means to be a Jew for the last 2,000 years, but we're much more conscious of it in the modern world than we have been in the past. So let's...
God forbid that the English should be set up as the explanation
yes.
of Torah. But in that one, Moses went out, he bowed.
Mm-hmm.
Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him.
Yes.
Blah, blah. Then English would have said, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law who bowed to him.
Right. So
Not
in
he.
English, even more than
Refers
that.
back to
Right.
Moses.
Exactly. Even that in English we have a rule that when you use a pronoun, that it refers to the last mentioned subject, usually.
Subject, right.
Right? But that's a rule that does have exceptions and can, both for literary and poetic reasons, be broken. Sometimes by authors to deliberately introduce ambiguity. So, A, the rules don't always apply in Hebrew that apply in English, and B, even if they did, that doesn't mean that a creative author or a creator author couldn't introduce ambiguity deliberately, even if the rules generally frowned on it.
What does the Hebrew here?
Here, the translation is actually very close to what the Hebrew actually says. JPS, I think, did a pretty good job. It says, as you just read, right? Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed to him, and he kissed him.
They
don't clarify.
The English refers to Moses.
Well, in English,
Not maybe.
according to English,
If you're
Right.
talking grammatically,
typical
it
English
does.
grammar
Yeah.
would say that the he refers back to the subject that was most recently named, which would be Moses.
Correct.
But that is not an ironclad rule in
Because
English.
there's a comma, not a period.
Well, commas and periods we invented. So,
I know,
Yes.
thank heaven.
all right. So let's take a look at another ambiguity and see if we can begin to disentangle some of this or get a little more confused. Because, as I say, confusion is the beginning of wisdom. We had our emendation here, but I need a reader now for the rest of this, or else I'm going to go hoarse.
I'll continue.
Harry? Okay, why not?
The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying,
Where's that?
Horeb.
Where's that?
Mount Sinai.
All right, so Horeb is considered by tradition to be a synonym for Mount Sinai. Right, we never actually see them in the same sentence, but according to our traditions, Horeb is the other name for Mount Sinai.
So you wouldn't call that a traditional emendation, would you?
No, because it doesn't. We didn't change the text.
Right.
We didn't actually even write a footnote on the page of the Torah. But according to tradition, when you see Horeb, you should think Sinai. When you think Sinai, you should think Horeb. That they are one and the same mountain with two different names, much like Denali and Mount McKinley. If someone says, I climb Denali, and someone else says, I climb Mount McKinley, they both climb the same mountain.
You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Start out. Thereupon I said to you, how can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? From each of your tribes, men who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads.
All right. So, back to our timeline. Judges. When did they get appointed according to the book of Deuteronomy? After what?
After this long sojourn
After the Decalogue.
After the Ten Commandments, after we had been there, well after the Ten Commandments, long enough that we had built the Mishkan. Right? We were already a couple years into our Exodus before we left Mount Sinai. So here we might be arguing about, a couple days before the Ten Commandments, a couple days after the Ten Commandments. Deuteronomy comes along and says, no, it's not a timeline. You got one of these little, the little wiggly things they do. And it says, 2 years. So we're not arguing about a couple days now. We're arguing about whether or not it happened 2 years on this side or that side. And the Torah doesn't know when Moses set up other judges. The Torah has two different opinions. And who set up the judges here? No mention of Yitro. It's just Moses goes, I've had enough.
Another question about the timeline. If this refers to a long sojourn after receiving Aser HaDibrot, that would include the time of Chei HaEgel, of the golden calf.
Yep.
And so the burden and bickering is putting it mildly.
Yes, absolutely. That we would understand even more so the pain that Moses would feel of shouldering the leadership of all these people. But if it happened after the golden calf, we might also wonder, well, how in the world would he trust them? Really, you're going to delegate to this lot? This rabble? You're going to actually let them have some control? And we talked a little bit last week about the idea that maybe not everybody was involved in all of the conspiracies, but certainly it might be possible to think that. But more than resolving the strict timeline, I want to talk about the basic question here that the Torah doesn't seem to know when he appointed the judges. The Torah seems to think it either happened because Jethro suggested it when they first arrived at Sinai, or because Moses got fed up and did it right before they set out to go to Israel. And that is a fairly substantial difference in opinion. Right? I mean, if I were to ask you, when did the TARP bill pass in Congress? The trouble asset relief program. When did that pass? Under whose administration? Which president? Bush. And yet, a large percentage of Americans think that it happened under Obama's administration. Well, that's a fairly substantial difference in time between the election of one and the appointment of the other. So it kind of makes a difference if you can figure out when these things happen. And whether or not there was a system of judicial delegation prior to the giving of the bulk of the law, or whether there was a system of judicial delegation after the law had already been in work and been working through Moses as the sole arbiter of law for years, makes a difference in the communal feel and in our own perception of whether or not you would do it on this side or that side, and the importance of delegation. I mean, after all, Moses was able to do it for years. So maybe you don't need to delegate. On the other hand, if you have to delegate before you start the job, maybe delegation is a primary value rather than a secondary. It can make a difference. This is not the only difference between the earlier books and the book of Deuteronomy. Now, Abarbanel, as you see from the next quote, his idea was to try and harmonize this by saying, well, what happened was that Jethro raised the idea. He suggested it, but it didn't get implemented until 2 years later. It's a long time to wait, but he's trying to harmonize the two texts. But there are some texts that are not merely needing to be harmonized, but are very much different words. For example, Shabbat. Right? In the Ten Commandments, there are two different words that are used as the primary verb for doing Shabbat. For what?
Shamor v'zachor.
Exactly. We're going to get to that, Shamor and Zachor. We're going to get to them in just a second. And beyond that, each of the two Ten Commandments provides different explanations. One says it's because of the fact that you've been liberated from Egypt, and the other says it's because you are commemorating the seventh day of rest from creation. So we have different verbs, we have different commemorations, and we have different details even on who is doing the rest between the Exodus versions of the Ten Commandments and the Deuteronomy version of the Ten Commandments. So here's a traditional, from the Talmud, explanation that I think most people might have heard at some point. Certainly if you've ever sung L'Chadodi and looked at the translation, the first line of the first stanza is this interpretation.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep the Sabbath day, two different places, were pronounced in a single act of speech, an act of speech that the mouth cannot express nor the ear take in.
All right. Normal human beings, when we talk, we only say one thing. Right? One word comes out of our mouth at a time. When God talks, God can put multiple words into the same sonic experience. And that's the notion that the Talmud is trying to bring here. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad is the line from L'Chadodi, right? The two words in a single utterance, a single speech. And that's something only God can do. And that's the reconciliation. Rather than going in the Samaritan way and erasing one of them and replacing it with the other one in order to harmonize it, we say, no, both are there, but God did that, we didn't. We couldn't do that, but God can. Accept it. Make sense? Yes, maybe? Not the only interpretation, however. We're going to get a lovely teaching here that might sound modern.
The latter version of the Decalogue
That's the Ten Commandments for those who don't know your Greek.
was said by Moses on his own account. Nonetheless, it is part of the written law. In addition to the mitzvot themselves that Moses had already received at Sinai by the word of God, these words as well, which were said on his own account, are part of the written law. This is like the dialogues of the patriarchs and other passages, the material that begins, and these are the things, represents the root of the oral law.
That's the beginning line of Deuteronomy, of Devarim.
The things that the sages of Israel say of their own account.
All right. Phew. Yeah, that may sound a little complicated. It's not too complicated to understand, but the implications are rather significant. Okay, so what Rabbi Tzadok of Lublin is trying to say here is that Moses said the words in Deuteronomy. Most of Deuteronomy, if you've read the text, you'll know, are speeches that Moses says. And it says, and Moses said, and then 10 chapters later we stop. There's one big quote mark at the beginning, one big quote mark at the end, and a few little things in between. His position here is that, yeah, Moses said them. Those were Moses' words. Moses' inflection, Moses' syntax, Moses' word choice. This was Moses talking. The same way that when it says Abraham said, that wasn't God with his hand up inside Abraham doing the ventriloquist dummy. That was Abraham talking. And the Torah chose to preserve those words. Similarly, according to our text, the words of Devarim, in the vast majority, are Moses' recount, retelling, restatement of what had happened before in his own words, which the Torah chose to preserve. So the fact that he rephrases things slightly, like when the judge happened, or that he rephrases things slightly, like whether it's keep or observe for Shabbat, or remember, depending upon the translation, or whether he rephrases things slightly in the issue of who sent the spies out, which is also in the first bit of Deuteronomy, shouldn't surprise us. This is his telling. And the Torah preserves it and sanctifies it. But it wasn't, in the strictest definition of the word, God dictating those words. How are we doing there? Okay? Because usually in Jewish discussions, we like to make a distinction between the Torah and everything else. Right? There is the written word. And the written word comes with a strict definition of divine dictation. Does that make sense? And everything else, well, that's sort of a little bit more loose. We maybe will make a ring for the words of the sages, which have the imprimatur of having been transmitted in more or less imperfect forms, as a reflection of what was given at the same time as the Torah, what we call the oral law. But definitely we don't consider those to be the same as the written law when it comes to the precision. Otherwise there wouldn't be debates within the mission of the Midrash and the Talmud. And then there's always the rest of us. What this text is saying is that, well, actually, there's kind of a permeable barrier that the words of the sages, the words of interpretation, are part of what's in the Torah. Just as Moses began the process. That when Moses did Deuteronomy, he was acting like one of the sages. He wasn't simply writing down what God told him to write down. He was writing down his take on Torah.
But
the first
Moses
4 books.
But Moses is different from all the sages.
Which you, what's that? But Moses is different than everyone, which is why his words get on that scroll, which is what gives him a canonical status that is different than the rest of us. But it shouldn't surprise us, though, that there are some slight variations in wording and phrasing between the first 4/5 of the Torah and the last fifth of the Torah. But that very notion for many is shocking, radical, heretical, but it's not foreign to our way of understanding this. Because we need a deeper understanding of what it means to have the text, what it means to interpret the text, and what it means to live the text. We need something more than just someone picked a book off the shelf, looked into it, saw the answer, and then did it. That's a very simplistic understanding of what it means to have a law and a book of laws that guides our lives. And this is the first step that I want us to take of understanding that there is more going on here than simply opening the book. That Moses himself, in his writing, is already writing a super, in every sense of the word, commentary on the first 4 books that he's already written down. I can see some questions and hands ready to go.
I'm very comfortable with this. It follows what I've learned and what I've come to believe. But I think that I'm not willing to take it the next step to the documentary hypothesis. And I think we have to be careful not to expand this.
Okay, so I wouldn't necessarily say that the documentary hypothesis is the necessary next step. Let's make sure everyone understands, and that's not where I'm going with it. Let's make sure everyone understands what the question is. Is the documentary hypothesis, which is often called biblical criticism, is the notion that there was one guy that wrote what's called the J text, and one guy that wrote the P text, and one guy that wrote the D text, and one guy that wrote the E text, and these are all different sub-fragments of texts that somebody later on took and sorted and made into one giant unified document. That's not where this has to go. Okay, this is not talking about having multiple authors embedded within different pieces. It's talking about having one author, capital A, that is recognizing that what has been given is then being understood and then being applied by successive generations. And that process all falls under that capital A author, meaning God. And that process is more ambiguous, it's messier, it's not neat, it's not clean, it doesn't fit into a PowerPoint presentation nicely than we might like. You know, most of us have a very simplistic notion of what we think laws and justice should be, right? There's a law, if you break the law, you are prosecuted, evidence is brought to show that you broke the law, and then justice is meted out according to the law. And it's very mechanistic. It's laws we treat like computer code in our way of thinking. That all you have to do is plug in the information, hit enter, and the outcome will be spit out by the printer. That's not what this is saying. They're saying, no, there was law given, and then there was law respoken, and then there was law interpreted, and then there was law lived according to that interpretation, and that's not a static process. It's not something that you can feed into a computer, because no computer is going to be able to handle this living, organic, and dynamic system, because there is intuition and spirit involved in this that computers don't have, at least not yet. All right, let's take a look at another example of how we handle this ambiguity before we start, hopefully, bringing it around to a fuller, deeper, and more contemporarily relevant understanding. All right, so Relbog picks up.
So we want to go,
We ought to. Mm-hmm.
We ought to attend to a most puzzling issue here in this account, and in many of the Torah's accounts.
I'm just going to pause here to let you know where he's talking. This is part of Relbog's commentary that comes at the end of the book of Shemot. We're kind of near the beginning at the moment. And this is after chapters and chapters and chapters talking about the design and the construction of the tabernacle, right? And anybody who's been very carefully reading through all of these parshiot will know it's a little repetitive, right? It's you get whole chapters that design everything down to the details, and then you get whole chapters that repeat everything, but in the active sense of saying, and they built it, and they built it, and they built it.
So do my father-in-law, father-in-law, father-in-law.
Even more so.
Okay, so this most puzzling issue is, owing to its perfection, the Torah should not contain anything repetitious or extraneous.
Right? This is not like, my novel, not that I've written a novel, but if I wrote a novel, I'm pretty sure that there'd be lots of stuff in it that was extraneous and imperfect, because I'm an extraneous and imperfect author. But when the author is capital A, author God, then we believe as a matter of faith that God didn't just throw stuff into the Torah because he forgot to edit it out, that it's there for a reason. Which means we're surprised at this repetitiousness of this section.
Yeah, because here we see repetitiousness without purpose. It would have been enough for the Torah to state, and Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, made the tabernacle as commanded by the Lord.
Boom! One sentence, 10 chapters saved. Right? The Torah would be a lot shorter. And
but things would be so much less colorful. You know,
but we already had the colors. We got the colors when it was designed. Why do we need the colors duplicated when it's being built?
Because there are new insights to learn from the repetition. I think there are new insights.
Hold that thought till we're on the next page.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right within a part of thinking. But I want to draw attention to Ralbag's rather surprising answer.
Okay, so we get such repetitiousness at many junctures in the Torah, and to this day, we have not found a compelling explanation for this.
Meaning, as Paula was saying, you can have many homiletical and midrashic explanations that can stir us and move us, but they're not essential. It's not like if we hadn't had the repetition, we could never have learned that. It's nice, but it's not something that we would have not been able to also get from other sources. So instead, perhaps
we may say that it was the convention at the time of the giving of Torah to fashion literature in this way, and that the prophet expresses himself through the conventions of the times.
All right, everyone's turning the page. Don't turn the page yet. Think about that, what he just said. Right, that some of the way the Torah was written and then restated by Moses and then interpreted, some of that style, not the core rules, but some of the style, was dependent upon the audience that first heard it. That for them, this type of retelling would have been perfectly expected as a process of what you do. You describe the glory of the king's palace, and then you describe the building of the king's palace. And that's not redundant at all. That's all the glory to God. You've done a perfectly normal literary act. Even though for us, and for Ralbag's day as well, it seems a little repetitious. For them, no problem. And we shouldn't be surprised that it's there.
Almost saying that that part of the Torah was written according to old literary customs.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at the Torah as written by God, irrespective of literary customs.
The two parts of that sentence, the last part, are not inexorably linked.
Okay.
The Torah being written by God
Right.
does not mean that it cannot also be written with respect to the contemporary literary style.
Okay,
Because the Torah was heard and read by a generation at first. I mean, that's something I know we forget because Torah is timeless, but the Torah was given and heard and read by a generation when it was first published, so to speak, copyright pending. This is the best-selling book of all time. If we got a copyright on that and got royalties, man, we'd be set. But we do know that the Torah and the rest of Tanakh does follow certain literary conventions that were common both within Hebraic society as well as within the general Near Eastern culture of the time. The way the Psalms and the poetry and the rhythms work, the way certain verbs conjugate in certain poems reflect very carefully a literary style that was broader than just the Torah, than just the Israelites. But again, that shouldn't surprise us, even with the author being God. Because why wouldn't God write a book that would be understood according to the literature of the day?
Well, why would he write it the way we, or the people of the day, could understand it? In the same way we talk about God's mighty arm, and sort of, which we know he doesn't have either. He's catering to our limited understanding vis-a-vis God. He's trying to make it so that we get
for the arms and metaphors, but let's be sure that we're not being chauvinistic in terms of our chronology. This literary form may be superior to our modern literary forms, right? I mean, who's to say that the literary form of the ancient Near Easterners wasn't superior to the literary form that produced the Twilight novels? Okay, so we don't necessarily want to think that it was inferior and we're better than they were. But we can think that this spoke to them in certain ways, this resonated and this was accepted by them in certain ways that we may not be able to appreciate because it's not our literary style today. But what we can appreciate is that the overall work still resonates with us today. And in fact, that's something that is a little distinct, well, very distinct, not to be too particularistic, from most of the other literature of the ancient Near Eastern period. If you go back and you read some of the ancient stories like the Ugaritic tales of Gilgamesh and such, there may be similar literary styles and features compared to Torah and Tanakh. Well, they're not that interesting. the works do not have the same compelling and the same resonance. So there is something special about the Torah, even though it may have been originally written in a literary style which is distant from our own modern preferences, that makes it still accessible despite our changing preferences for literary style. But that still brings us back to ambiguity and law. We're going to get another contra opinion. Make sure that we understand the text on the top of the next page is not my opinion, but is an opinion often advanced and quoted and often misquoted. And I want to make sure that we understand why it doesn't work.
Man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Man is the world of man, the state, the society.
All right.
Karl Marx.
Karl Marx, right? So his critique of Hegelian, or his explanation of Hegelian philosophy. This is a little later on is where you get the very famous line of religion being the opiate of the people. But this is more important for our purposes. Just like the Samaritans, he's also bothered by some of the ambiguities in the text and in religion. The Samaritans just fix the text. He throws out the text because he says the author isn't divine, the author is us. So you shouldn't be surprised that there are ambiguities in the text because it's human construct, human made, and therefore also humanly disposable.
Was he a knowledgeable Jew?
I have no idea how knowledgeable he was. I don't know how.
He wasn't Jewish.
What's that?
There's controversy.
About whether he was actually Jewish or not?
He was Jewish.
No, I always thought so too. But,
Interesting.
probably not.
Oh.
Very interesting. Now, I hadn't heard one way or the other. But unfortunately, knowledgeable or not, plenty of people in his day especially were attacking Judaism and were seeking alternatives, shall we say. And his explanation, of course, for the ambiguities was, hey, what do you expect? If it's man-made, it's going to be flawed. And the fact that there are flaws incontrovertibly teaches us that there cannot have been a divine author. See how that logic works? Right? Everything man makes is flawed, therefore everything that is flawed is man-made. That's not a good logical syllogism, but it is one that is often taken. And where does it break down? Well, not everything that is flawed is actually, by our definition, is actually flawed. And not everything that we think of as is flawed if you understood what it was attempting to do rather than what you thought it was supposed to do. If we thought Torah was supposed to give us clear, concise legal codes, similar to what you would find if you went and looked in the Florida State House, then yeah, the Torah is pretty messed up. It's not a good law book by that standard, by that definition. But that would be a faulty way of looking at it. Because that's not what Torah was trying to do, and it's not what Judaism has been trying to do. If you thought that Torah was supposed to be perfectly consistent through every generation without reflecting any change, iota, or adaptation, because after all, if God's eternal, why would there be change? Then yeah, you're going to think the Torah is pretty messed up, and you're going to think Judaism is pretty messed up. Because there does seem to be evidence of change and adaptation and application being varied. You know, think, for example, of some of the cases that we see in the Torah. What is Yibum, the Levirate marriage? Right? Vague idea, right? Remember? You got two brothers. One's married, dies without having a kid. The other brother takes the wife, takes the widow as his wife, gets her pregnant, and the child born is considered to be a descendant of the dead brother and inherits according to that line. That's the clear, clean rule. What happens in the book of Ruth? Who's Boaz to Ruth? Is it her brother-in-law?
No.
He's a kinsman.
He's a kinsman. He's like a cousin. What about Judah and Tamar? Is Judah her brother-in-law?
No, he's the
No,
father.
he's the father-in-law. So the application of that, what seems like a simple law, is actually quite varied. In Judaism, for theft, not robbery or violence or anything, but just straight theft. I sneak into your field, I steal a sheep, and I get back to my field, and then I get caught by the police. Can I be executed for stealing a sheep? No. No. For physical theft, there is no death penalty in Judaism. Something that didn't actually get caught up to in the West until the 20th century, where people were still being hung and executed for stealing things. But when the prophet Nathan comes to King David and gives a case, which is actually fictional, it's a metaphor, about a man who was very wealthy and who stole his neighbor's only lamb, what does David say is the penalty? Death! But Torah doesn't say you can execute people for stealing. Even if it is a really offensive stealing, Torah doesn't talk about that. But David thought that it was an appropriate application of the law for that terribly egregious situation. Even though the text itself did not say explicitly, that's what you should do in this exceptional circumstance. Any more than when Solomon said, cut the baby in half. No one said, excuse me,
Yeah.
where in Torah does it say we do this? No one said that. Because it was considered a reasonable action for a king to adjudicate the law in a circumstance like that if he thought that was the most appropriate means of making sure that the Torah was interpreted and lived. Otherwise, the mother would have said, well, he's not going to really kill the kid because he can't. No, he could. Okay. So what do we do? If Torah between what's on the page and what's getting implemented can look so different, what do we do? All right, Paula, you were leading towards this next text, unbeknownst to you.
Okay.
Although it might be familiar. It's a relatively famous piece of a much larger text from the Talmud.
Okay. Said Judah said Rabbah, at the time that Moses went up on high, he found the Holy One in session, affixing crowns to the letters.
Right, so Moses goes up Mount Sinai, and he's with God, and what does he see God doing? He sees God being a sofer, writing a Torah, and he's even putting on the crowns on the top of the letters. Those of you who have seen the Torah up close know what we're talking about, the special font.
He said to him, Lord of the universe, who is stopping you?
All right, so that's an idiom, again, literary style from their days. Who's stopping me? He's like, who's making you do this? Who's stopping you from just giving it to us now with the letters, with or without fancy font affixed? Fancy font affixed. It's good alliteration. Who's stopping you from just delivering the goods, right? Why do I have to wait 40 days up here while you put on little filigree when it could be done and back in the world? Why bother?
God said to him, there is a man who is going to arrive at the end of many generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name, who is going to interpret on the basis of each point of the crowns heaps and heaps of laws. Moses said, Lord of the universe, show him to me. Oh, I love this story. God said to him, turn around.
All right, so he says, I'm putting these on because many generations from now, more than 1,000 years, there's going to be this guy named Akiva, and based on the font, he will interpret laws.
Moses took a seat at the end of 8 rows.
Meaning he sits at the back of the room in the Beit HaMidrash, in the house of study, which in those days was ranked according to ability, which means in that school, he was at the back of the room. Moses was at the back of the room.
But he could not grasp what the people were saying.
Like, what are they talking about? What is this argument? Well, if you guys, when we've studied Talmud, it can be a little difficult to get your head around. Moses felt it was hard too.
He felt faint. But when the teaching reached a certain point, and the disciples said, My Lord, how do you know this? And he answered, It is a law given to Moses from Sinai, Moses regained his composure.
Thank you for the clarifying of the pronouns. Okay, so Moses is listening to them discussing Torah, discussing law, halakha. And he can't make heads or tails of what they're saying. This is a little time-traveling vision, in case you're wondering, right? He's like, I don't follow a single thing that they are saying. This is not the law that I learned. This is not the Torah I got. They're doing something that seems so totally different than what I had. And yet, when one of the students asks, where do we get this from? What's the source of this? This is the law given to Moses from Sinai. And then he's okay. Then he's okay. Right? How can he be okay when Akiva just claimed that the citation for what he was describing was Moses if Moses didn't understand it? Shouldn't that have made Moses angrier? I feel like I'm in the Revolutionary War. I was very patriotic. So I would have thought if someone was giving a lecture and I couldn't make sense of anything they were saying, and then at the very end of it they said, oh, this comes from Rabbi Joshua Neely, I'd be, how dare you claim that I said that gobbledygook? That's not me at all. I don't know where you got that from. Maybe it is good. I don't know, but it's not me. But Moses is fine. Why is he fine with this? For having the attribution to something he doesn't know or understand.
Maybe he realizes that times have changed, and over those 1,000 years, there are new situations that require new interpretations of the law.
Times have changed. Situations have required new interpretations or interpretations in areas and ways that hadn't been foreseen by Moses. And yet, what's that? It's still valid, and it is still from Sinai. That when the law needed to be interpreted, understood, and applied to new situations, they didn't say, get out that eraser, we're going to rewrite this part of the Torah. They didn't say, the Torah clearly wasn't divine because it didn't anticipate our situation the way Marx did. They said, okay, what does the Torah tell us that we can use to solve this problem? To understand this situation, to answer this question, to meet this new challenge? And what can we do that uses the tools that come down to us from Sinai, through Moses, through the sages, through the last 3,000 years, that have been filtered and refined like pure spring water, that allow us to continue to use it to do something today? So they reject the emendation of the Samaritans, they reject the rejection of Marx, but they don't say it didn't change. They don't say it isn't different. And Moses is proud of the fact that the people understood that the Torah was not meant to be put into a crystal case and kept under glass, and that when we took it out we didn't change it, but that we let it live. All right, so we're going to get a couple more texts that put this into a bit more of a modern perspective, and then we're already running a bit over time because we had such a nice chat at the beginning. So let's go ahead and keep running. Harriet, I'll go back to you since you had the honor first. Huh?
Okay. To love society is to love both something beyond us and something in ourselves. We could not wish to be free of society without wishing to finish our existence as men. The only question that a man can ask is not whether he can live outside society, but in what society he wishes to live.
So Emil Durkheim, great anthropologist, sociologist of the 20th century. A lot of wonderful writings, but this one in particular was very striking for this case because he introduces a point that we're going to need to get just to get to our end, which is that we have Torah, we have God, and we have understanding, but we also have society. Those are all people. I'm not an artist, okay? I don't play one on TV. See, heads, legs, one long arm, right? I'm sideways. What do you want? If you came for the art, you're disappointed, okay? But we have society, and in this case, we're talking about the Jewish society. We're talking about the Klal Yisrael, that they are also part of this process, that they are also part of taking what was written in the Torah, what was expanded and understood by Moses, and then interpreted and applied by the sages, that we are responsible for living it. Which means it has to be livable, And it means it has to be living, because we are. And society needs it. We need this that is beyond ourselves, says Durkheim. We need this structure, this order of society to give ourselves meaning and purpose. And we can't escape that. You can't go live in a hermitage somewhere. You have to be part of a society. So the question is, which society do you choose to be part of? And what impact, in Judaism's question, does this have on this? That if the Torah is not simply radiating out the crystallized, clear words of God in some immutable and pure and unadulterated or unexpandable fashion, but if there is instead this dynamic interrelationship, what role do the people play in all of this process? Well, conservative Judaism talks about this.
Conservative Judaism calls attention to the fact that Judaism through the ages has manifested an inner dynamism. The masters of Judaism could not ignore the winds of circumstances and doctrines that swirled around them. Judaism has itself provided the mechanism for legal change and interpretation, and so has grown in the face of the exigencies of life.
All right? We've grown precisely because of society surrounding this core has pulled and pushed and moved and brought new ideas in or rejected ideas that were coming out, that it gave it a shape, that gave it a body, that gave it a form. That society is the living construct of Torah and interpretation when we actually bother to be Jewish. And that this is what has given us this living, beating dynamism that allowed Judaism to survive. If you cut out this, if you cut out the outside world, then Judaism becomes a museum piece. It becomes no more relevant than the stories of Gilgamesh to anyone's life or to the world. On the other hand, if you cut out this, then it just becomes either whatever the academics think or whatever the mobs think. It becomes no anchor. Just do whatever you like. And then indeed it becomes what Marx says. It's just made up, and so you can do whatever you feel like. You need all of the components.
Everything you just said, you could also say about the Constitution, in terms of it being a living document.
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily include God, but yes. I wouldn't go so far as to say God inspired the Constitution, but as far as being a living, breathing document which needs both the core text to remain as intact as possible rather than just changing it on a whim, and you need the people to live it, and you need people to continue to wrestle it, and it will adapt according to the society in ways that are necessary without doing too much. Absolutely, that parallel stands.
It always amazes me how the Constitution, as a man-made document, withstands the test of time and is right up there, right next to the Torah, as being just an unbelievable,
human
document.
Achievement. Yes, a document. And I would just add to that, all good law does. It's just that we haven't had a lot of good law. That when we truly understand what law is meant to do, that it is meant to connect us to something greater than ourselves, to perfect and shape society in positive ways, and to do it in a way that allows us to have the humility to know that we cannot anticipate today what's going to happen next year, but that we should be ready for it and ready to adapt as needed, but only when needed, is a very hard balance for us to make. Usually we don't like law because it forces us to do things we don't want, or keeps us from doing things we want to do or think we want to do. And we don't like law because it's complicated. We don't like law to be fluid because that seems unfair. If it was legal last year, why can't it be legal this year? If it wasn't legal last year, why should it be legal this year? We get upset by that. But that's what good law is. That's what it should be. And that's why we come to our last two quotes.
God, Torah, and Israel are one.
That's not just a bumper sticker. God, Torah, and Israel are one. That's our Holy Trinity. And when we're talking about Israel here, we're not just talking about geography. We're talking about B'nai Yisrael, the people of Israel, us. Us in this room and us all over the world. We are Torah, meaning that without us, Torah just becomes an ancient book that has for some reason managed to stay on bookshelves. But without Torah, we're just some holdover cultural aberration. And without God, well, all of it just is a bit of a nonsense. And yet, with us, we shape God's Torah through our lives. It's not a static thing that we simply squeeze ourselves into fitting. But it's also not something that we squeeze into fitting us. It's a dance. You know, and anyone who's ever danced knows that there's someone leading, someone following, but they both have to be together. Otherwise, you get a lot of hurt toes. Right? This is the ultimate unity of what our purpose is in this world, which comes to the last quote.
You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and I am God. That is, when you are my witnesses, I am God. And when you are not my witnesses, I am not God.
Whoa, yeah, okay.
I thought you were trying to clear things up for us. This is worse than
Midrash Tehillim, right? So the Midrash says, I'm not God without you being my witnesses. Because what is God if there is no living, breathing, vital representation of God in the world? Right? God is not going to be standing out on the street corner, you know, introducing himself to people. God doesn't write his name in the sky. God is not God, meaning is not connected to the universe of his creation without us. Otherwise, God is invisible to the world. We are testimony that God exists. But we're only that testimony when we actually live a life of Torah. And again, I'm trying to point out, it's not as simple as saying you just open the book and do what it says. But living in that process, living and breathing this wonderful swirling dynamism, isn't just about us, it's about God's presence in the world. Which is why when people talk about law being in opposition to spirit or to spirituality, it drives me crazy. Because what greater form of spirituality is there than to believe that we are the embodiment of God's will in this world in a beautiful and sacred way by trying to live according to this wonderful flowing ocean of Torah. Does it get more spiritual than that? I mean, really? That we have this wonderful opportunity, this sacred chance to connect to something greater than ourselves and to connect it to this world through us, simply by trying to do what's right, simply by trying to live a life according to these mitzvot, these laws. That's just gorgeous. So, keep studying, keep doing, and not necessarily in that order.